Welcome to the Analog Gamers Podcast, a short podcast on board games and board gaming experiences. Here are your hosts.
I'm Shane.
And I'm Brent.
And I'm Frank.
Thanks for joining us today on the Analog Gamers. Today we're going to talk about movement in board games. Now, this isn't the movement that takes place when somebody loses, gets really mad, and flips the table. That's a whole different kind of movement of board games and pieces. Today we're actually going to talk about the movement that you can make within the game to accomplish different strategies or different things within the game. One of the most familiar of these is linear movement. So this is, as we talk about, Monopoly is kind of a base comparison game. In Monopoly, you're moving clockwise around the game. You only have that option. You don't have option to move your pieces in any other manner or in any other direction. A similar game would be Parcheesi. And then a variant on this idea would be backgammon. So linear movement is the most familiar to us. Your pieces are going in one direction, everybody's moving the same direction. Where you land basically has an impact on what you're doing for that turn. Frank, what's another kind of movement that we see commonly in board games?
So another one we see is what I think of as square movement. It doesn't necessarily have to be square per se, but the think about chess or checkers, where the board is a grid, an 8x8 grid, and those squares that are there define the movement. So chess, and a bishop might move diagonally, but nonetheless, it is the squares that are defining it. The bishop that's on the white squares is always going to be on the white squares. The rook is always going to move orthogonally, always going to move up, forward, back, side to side. The knight moves one of each, right? One diagonal, one orthogonal, and that's his movement.
So are you saying any board game with movement that uses squares in the board construction would be this square movement type?
And you can move in any direction. It's not just a forward. So the pawns have linear movement. They can only move forward or diagonally if they're attacking. But the back row pieces in chess have what I'm thinking of as this square movement, where they can move in any direction. Brent, you were going to say something.
No, I was going to point out that it's moving in one of those four directions, moving at one of the compass points there on a square.
Now, the weird exceptions to those are racing games. So movement is not important in every game, obviously. If you're playing a card game, movement's not going to be important, generally. There might be exceptions. But if you're playing poker, there's no movement in poker. So it comes into play into games where the spatial arrangement is important. The one that always comes to mind for me, partly because I'm a fan of them, is war games. There are war games, for instance, Feudo, where it is a square, and you can move in any direction, but that does define how you're moving. Forward, backwards, maybe diagonally. Feudo, you can't move diagonally. I'm trying to think of others.
So even a game we've talked about, like Betrayal at House on the Hill, where you're moving throughout the board, constructing the board as you go, but each of those pieces is a square, and you only have so many choices to move. And that's determined by the rooms, right? If there's not a door, you
Correct.
Can't go through the wall.
Right.
So is that the same type of movement that we're talking about here with chess or checkers?
In my mind, it is.
Okay.
Other than the fact that you don't have diagonal. Another one where I was going earlier was racing games have a lot of this. What you will see in racing games a lot of times is you either can to block. As you're moving forward, you can also move laterally, so effectively diagonally. So for instance, Daytona 500, you can do that to try and set up either a position where you're blocking people or where you're trying to draft off of somebody else's car. In Snowtails, you have to drift. They refer to that kind of movement as drifting. And you have to drift or you will crash, because it's trying to, the way the lanes are constructed, they will eventually, and given enough curves, hit the outer wall. And that's trying to reflect the fact that you're sliding through the turns. So the lanes kind of swing out as they go around, and you have to drift to the inside of the track so that you don't hit the wall.
Yeah, and in I think every racing game I've played, the board setup is there's a track that covers the whole board, but then the track is actually made up of small squares or rectangles, and those squares or rectangles are your placement. So when you say move laterally, you're not just moving forward by rectangles, but you're moving diagonally by rectangles
Yes.
as well.
Yeah, so I have Steampunk Rally is an exception to that. Steampunk Rally, the board is just big squares, and everybody's in the big squares. It's just a track of big squares. The other one that's different than that is when you get into dexterity racing games. Obviously, those don't have squares at all. You're flicking or doing something like that. That's an entirely different thing, and I am really, really, really horrible at dexterity games, so I have no experience playing a dexterity-based racing game.
So one of the square movements that's not one of the traditionals and not a racing game that we all like is the Forbidden Island and Forbidden Desert games. They're essentially the exact same game. There are minor rule differences based on what you're trying to do, but I think that instead of trying to go around a track or trying to go a specific place or having to go forward, the nice thing is you can go any which of the ways because you want to go do something. And it's an action point game, which we've talked about. So you're trying, one of your actions is movement in one of those directions.
And I would argue there's also some element of point-to-point movement in that game, introduced mostly by the helicopter. So the helicopter, instead of moving to one of the squares that's right next to you, the helicopter you can pick up from one square and move to any other square.
So that's not the traditional definition of point-to-point.
So what's point-to-point?
So point-to-point is a method where you are moving. So the locations on the map, they're not squares. They're not hexagons. We'll talk about hexagons in a little bit. But they're not squares. They're not hexagons. They're not anything like that. They're not an area on the board. They literally are a point on the board, a city. And it's a world map, and there's a city. So the city is effectively a point. Go ahead,
So when
Brent.
I think of point-to-point, what I think about is the points and a connecting line to
Yes.
other points. So you could take the entire background of the board off the board, and you could play with just those points and those lines in that same configuration and have the same feel most of the time.
So Pandemic is the one that, to my mind, is we could go into war games. Hannibal, Rome versus Lecter, Washington's War. Those are specifically point-to-point games. But the one that probably has a better chance of being known amongst our audience is Pandemic. And to move from city to city, there are times when you can literally pick up and move across the map, regardless of adjacency. But typically, when you're talking about point-to-point, adjacency still matters. That line that goes from city to city defines adjacency, and I have to move along that line. That's point-to-point, traditionally.
I see your point.
Wow.
But
Thank you.
So would a game like Fury of Dracula be point-to-point movement?
Typically, yes.
Yes, that would be point-to-point movement.
Because in Dracula, you're either going to use the lines connecting the places or the trains
The
connecting
roads
the
or
places.
the trains.
Yeah, and they're just two different sets of lines.
So clearly in Forbidden Island, the helicopter introduces a different kind of movement. Would you still say that's square, even though you're not following adjacency, you're not following, the points that are, or the squares that are next to you? What type of movement would that be introducing into that game?
Magical.
Yeah, I almost think that's not actually a movement as much as a feature.
Yes.
Because your character is going somewhere else, but they're not moving there. They're just there.
It's a break in the rules in some respects.
You're not actually getting on a helicopter, and that helicopter's not choosing a path and making its way to somewhere.
It's teleportation, effectively, from a game perspective. And there are lots of games that have this, right? Forbidden Island, Forbidden Desert, Fury of Dracula, you can use Sense of Emergency to jump all the way across the map.
Pandemic, Reign of Cthulhu has it with a teleport.
So would that be the same?
Petraeus House on the Hill has a limited version of that in the Mystic Room, right?
Mystic Elevator.
Mystic Elevator.
So would that also be right in Pandemic? Can't you build? I don't remember what they're called, buildings or whatever they are, and then you can jump from one directly to the other.
So yes.
What are those?
So
what are
those
buildings
are the research
called?
stations.
Research stations. Is that this teleportation movement?
So yes, actually that's not a form of movement I had thought of going into this podcast, but I think that's a legitimate point to bring up. Is there are games with teleportation, magical movement where you can go from anywhere on the board to any place else on the board, and you're not following any designated path. So I'll give you another one. Another form of that is there are games that had hidden movement. And so, for instance, War of the Ring, you are moving the companions, Frodo and the ring, to Mount Doom, but your exact path, you're just saying I've moved the X number of spaces, and your exact path isn't determined until you reveal yourself or you're discovered, and then you say, oh, this is the path I chose to get there. But you can make that decision at the end of that, you're not deciding that up front.
The other one is Star Trek fleet captains with the Romulans cloaking mechanisms.
Right, although you still have to follow the hexes to do that.
Yeah,
but
you had to have made legitimate movements, but
right.
you don't have to tell how you did that.
Right, yeah, that's true.
So does this movement have a name, or are we?
It's typically referred to as hidden movement.
No. I mean the teleportation. Are we coining that? Or is that what it's called?
We're coining that.
There you go. You heard it here. Teleportation.
So,
and I think something interesting about that type of movement, I can't think of any game that is the type of movement. That tends to be a one-time or very rare exception to point-to-point movement, square movement, area movement, any of these types of movement that we see.
I would agree. I mean, it's chaotic otherwise, right? I mean, if you've played chess with a kid, with a 4-year-old, you completely understand how chaotic that can be, because they're just making it up as they go. It does add that Hail Mary pass at the end of the game, and that's one of the advantages of it. Pandemic, you're trying to get going faster and faster as that game goes on, and being able to go fly between research stations. Even that, in some ways, is point to point. You've just defined 5 or 6 points around the map where you can do this special movement, this extra quick movement. But Fury of Dracula, I don't know how many times Dracula's in trouble because, the game's, there's an opportunity somebody's jumped on him when he wasn't prepared.
Right.
No, that's why I like Pandemic Reign of Cthulhu's teleportation, because as the game goes on, you're closing down those teleportation points, and so the farther in the game you get, the harder it is to use one of those.
Well, one of the things that's interesting about Pandemic Reign of Cthulhu versus Pandemic is in Pandemic, the players get to use the teleportation. You can do that in Reign of Cthulhu, but the bad guys are using that too. And there's a risk as the player using them. So it's a little bit dicier to use those, to not be trying to be funny. But in all honesty, there's some risk involved that is not involved in Pandemic.
He was trying to be punny because you use dice when you use one of those.
So, any rate.
So we've talked a little about square, linear, point to point. What are some other types of movement that are in some of our favorite games?
So I don't think we can go without mentioning hexagons. Hexagons developed because they developed from wargaming. The idea being that if I really want to go in a diagonal motion, but I have to move left then up to make that diagonal, I've had to make 2 moves when realistically actual troops would do that in 1 move. So how do we fix that? Well, the way somebody did some math, determined that hexagons are the geometric shape with the largest number of sides that still form a complete pattern without gaps. So the other thing is better approximates a circle because you can go through the left forward space this time and the right forward space this time, and it really isn't that much of a jig or jog to slow you down, and you're going at it. But that still shows up in modern Command and Colors is one of the games that still shows up to. They still use hexes in that. So there are still ones being published that do that. So it's closest to a circle. And the other thing that they did was they would then stick a terrain icon in there that says this is this kind of terrain. And they would use movement points. We talked about action points in the last episode. They would use movement points in the same way to move across the map. Different terrain would take different kinds of movement points for different types of troops. In modern games, they've simplified that. Normally, there's no movement points. That terrain stops you. You enter it and stop, or you can't enter it unless that's the only hex you've moved this turn, or something like that. They've way simplified it. But that's still there. But it shows up in other games that are out there. Although I'm struggling to think of any.
One of the places that I've definitely seen this take a foothold of squares and hexagons is in RPGs, where a lot of people running RPGs will overlay on top of a map a square grid or a hexagon grid to really help the players dictate their movement. So one square might be 5 feet or whatever that designation is. And they'll overlay this on a map of a cavern or a tomb to really help them calculate movement better within the RPG world. right? Because if you're just playing on a blank map, it can be hard to remember distances and
Right.
where terrain is. And so these kind of mechanisms have been used in RPGs to kind of help define better for players spatial awareness within the game.
So go ahead, Brent.
So where I like the terrain also is in the point to point with Fury of Dracula, where in the west or in the east, sorry, the trains are worse, and so it's not an actual train, but it does slow down your movement the
Yes.
same way.
That is true. So there are two. While you guys were talking, I thought of two games that are not war games in the traditional sense at all, but use hexagons. One of which is Conan, which is a skirmish game. So it's a fighting game, but not a war game. You're not moving masses of troops. And the other one is Clash of Cultures. We've talked about that several times. There is warfare in the game, but it's not essentially a war game. It is essentially a civilization building game.
Yeah.
And that has hexagons because not only is the warfare movement important, but you're trying to establish additional towns in your kingdom. And so movement to do that is important. And on top of that, it's important for resource collection.
Well, in that game, it also helps with trading with other cities as well as exerting cultural influence
Right.
in proximity. And so, yeah, it's used for movement as well as kind of defining how close your civilization is to others for trading, cultural influence, and all that.
So generally in all of these games, the important concept is if adjacency matters, you've got to figure out some way to do that. Now, in my experience, the other thing that's happened is that people said, okay, this this movement point system is cumbersome and you got to remember a bunch of stuff. So they simplified it and said, instead of doing that, let's make tough terrain to pass through smaller so you don't get as far. But you still only got to move quote unquote one.
Mm-hmm.
So the classic game for this, so that's reflective of terrain. The game that I always think of when this is War of the Ring, where when you're passing through the mountain spaces are very small. When you're passing through open fields, the spaces are very big. For those of you who haven't played a game that's seen this, this is called area movement, and the common game that exemplifies that is Risk, although it's not really reflective of terrain. It's just a way to make the map interesting. But it's the idea that if you're going through Asia, and there's a couple of huge spaces in Asia, I can't remember which ones they are, but Urals is pretty big and connects to a lot of stuff. That's a way to get through fast, whereas if you're in, Europe, you got a bunch of tiny little countries that slow you down.
So is that where you would put something like Mission Red Planet, where you have only 5 areas on the board, and it's almost a game of which ones connect to each other as well?
Yes.
Because they're almost puzzle piece-like.
Right. And in fact, I don't know if you've done this, but I've actually sat there and looked at the board and said, which one of these areas connect to the most other areas, because those are the critical ones. And that's, as you get to some experience in Mission Red Planet, those tend to be the territories that they see a little more action than some of the other ones. That and the ones with the high point value, but
that in Mission Red Planet, there's only one interior, and that's the one that you can't get to or you can't destroy someone using the soldier card.
Yes.
So
right.
that
So it
one's
makes a difference.
important for a different reason, but it depends on where it is on the board.
Exactly.
So the board structure is almost the key there.
Right.
One that I wanted to bring up, because I think it's a different kind of movement, is a Mistborn House War. In that, as you pull cards, they go into a spot on the board, and they march across the board almost, each turn moving one forward until they get to the end of the board, and you have until they get to the end of the board to solve those. It's not a player movement; it's a movement of of a piece of the game.
So I played a half a game of Mistborn before I had to step out and somebody took my spot. But is this similar to Dracula's movement in Fury of Dracula, which is kind of laid out by cards? It's point-to-point movement, but it's laid out by cards, not by actually moving a figure on the map. Because Dracula's got hidden movement in that game.
Dracula is still moving in that game.
That's true.
So the difference is, there are 5 spots on the board, 5 places, and they're marked 1 through 5. As you pull a problem, depending on how complex that problem is, it goes in one of those slots. The next, as the person finishes their next turn, it's going to move up in complexity. and it doesn't actually change what you have to do to solve it, but if it gets to the end of the board, there is an effect. So you have that length of time of the
Okay.
card moving across the board to solve that problem.
I was just going to say, so you're not talking about character movement or player movement, you're talking about timeline movement.
Right.
So a game that's kind of similar, in my mind, is Legendary. So in Legendary, you have a villain deck, and you flip the top card of the villain deck into the first part of the city, and that might be the sewers. Then every turn, as you flip more cards, they move from the sewers to the streets, to the city, to the rooftop. So those villains are considered to be moving throughout the city, but on the board, you're just shifting the card up by one. And then eventually they might escape off of the rooftops, and if they escape, bad stuff happens.
So is there a map of the city?
No, there's not a map. It's just five areas to put the cards in there labeled sewers, street, city, or whatever that label
Do
is.
they always start in the sewer?
Yeah.
So that was the thing I thought was interesting about Mistborn, is they could start up higher.
There may be a few exceptions, but for the most part, you flip them and they start in the sewer, and then they progress through the city until eventually they escape from the city. And as the heroes, you're trying to take them out.
But from a gameplay perspective, it's not really a location. Because there's no map. It's just an indication.
I mean, depending on how much you're willing to, really engage the theme and engage the representation of those cards moving. Because we can all imagine villains going through a city and progressively, attacking different parts of the city. And that's really what that represents. So even though there's not, a map, a grid, there's still representation of them moving throughout the city and attacking these different points.
Do the locations have an influence on what happens there?
Yes, there can be.
Okay, so then
that's the difference.
So say you have Storm in your hand and you place the character Storm. She does extra damage if the villain is on the rooftop. And there are other things that do things such as that wherever the villain is has influence on the actions that might be taken by the characters in your deck.
So I'm really glad you brought this up, Brent, because one of the things I've been thinking about, but couldn't figure out how it fit into this topic, was Pathfinder the Adventure card game, right? Which, if you play strictly according to rules, the locations, quote unquote, where the villains are, you can move from one to any other one. It doesn't really matter. There's no grid, there's no lines, there's nothing that defines that movement. You're just, I'll go to this pile of cards, and then this pile of cards, and this pile of cards. But, in some sense, yes. But, they do have an influence on what happens there. You may not be able to use certain things, or you may have to take extra damage when you take damage, or whatever. That location does make a difference. And that's the difference between an indication and a location to me, is does it actually have some thematic or mechanical relevance to what happens at that location.
So the one that strikes me with that, though, is King of New York or King of Tokyo. In King of Tokyo, that's very simplified, obviously, because if you're in Tokyo versus you're out of Tokyo.
There's two spaces, in and out.
Right. But if you're in Tokyo, you're going to be attacked by everyone who's not, and if you're out, but you're going to get more victory points. So the location matters there. King of New York, it matters more because you have a whole bunch of locations, everyone's on the board.
Yes.
And it depends on what's in that location. But the locations themselves are the important piece of that, not necessarily the movement back and forth between them.
That's true. Yes.
And yet that's so simple mechanic, right, in King of Tokyo, of okay, now I have to pick my piece up off of the artwork of Tokyo, move it off, and somebody else puts theirs on. That game can't function without that mechanic.
No, it can't.
I mean, that is the central mechanic of that game, is being in or out of Tokyo. And so
it needs a board representation.
When I think about board games, it's not just, is this mechanic an important part of my strategy, but does this mechanic help define the game, and could this game be played without the mechanic? So even though there are a lot of games with movement that movement isn't the point of the game, or isn't, a set part of strategy, it's still, that game couldn't function without that movement within the game.
Well, we could debate whether being in Tokyo or out of Tokyo is part of your strategy. But
absolutely.
But nonetheless, I see your point.
Yeah.
Someone has to be in there, though, so it is a key feature of the game.
It is.
Whereas, and I'm going to take that and run with that, opposite to that, a game called BattleCon is all about, it has nothing to do with the game. You can move back and forth, and it's a linear line that you can move back and forth on. but the position is how far away you are from the other character. And that's what determines what actions you can perform.
So it's a relative position.
So it's a relative position to the other players that matters. And that's part of the full strategy of the game, not just the mechanic of the game. And I find that one interesting because it emulates old style street fighting and some of the old video games there where, you want to be so far away so that you can punch them or kick them or, whatever. But
and far enough away they can't grapple you.
Right. And you got to work with what's that other person going to move back and forth and how close are they going to get to me and try to plan that out beforehand.
So a game that I have played once and fell in love with is Star Wars Rebellion. Is that an area movement game?
Yes, it's an area movement game. It does not represent terrain per se. I mean, it's supposed to represent distance. So, you've got the outer rim of the galaxy and that kind of stuff. So where the planets are relative to each other is kind of important, but it's almost more important from a backstory perspective, not from an actual mechanical perspective.
I think the only kind of terrain difference would be, right, whether you're actually on a planet or in space.
Correct.
Very different functions happen whether
Right.
you're one or the other.
You have ground troops and
So the board in
space
Star Wars
troops.
Rebellion is basically just a big
Area movement.
area movement. It's a big map, but instead of countries or islands, it's planets.
It's very much like Risk in that sense.
Yeah.
Especially if you ever sat down and compared Risk to something like Star Wars Risk, then compared that to Rebellion, you would see that you're moving. They're really kind of the same. The question is how complicated did they draw the areas? That's the only thing. It's a little bit more simple. And you have, and just like in Risk, in Star Wars Rebellion, you have regions. So think continents in Risk. And there are things that if you control the planets in one region, you get a victory point. In that game,
Whatever
it's
that bonus is. Yeah.
Yeah, you get a bonus. I want to step back to Pathfinder Adventure card game because it just, in this discussion, when we played that game, when we played the campaign, we actually said, it doesn't make sense that you can go from the courtyard to the dungeon without going through the front gate. So we actually, never really thought about this, but we basically took a teleportation kind of movement system and forced it into a point-to-point movement system where you may have some options. You may not have to, in all point-to-point systems, you can move in multiple directions. Otherwise it would be linear, right? So, but we kind of changed that and said, and I didn't think about that in terms of, it was intentional. It wasn't an accident, but we did change the movement mechanism from one style to another. And I never thought about it in those terms.
Sometimes, and I think if we're considering that a point to point, what I find interesting there is we had sometimes said, essentially, this is the blocker.
Yeah, choke
Yes.
point.
This is, got to get through the tower before you can go inside. But then we connected the points for the other locations, and we could go to any of the other ones.
Yes.
So it was yes, almost a point to point, but we opened up some other teleportation locations in there.
So, not in my mind, but we could debate this. But in my mind, it's no different from if you want to go from South America to Africa in Risk, you have to go through Brazil and North Africa, and then the rest of the continents open up. So it's point to point for that one spot. I wouldn't call it teleportation. I would just call it point to point with a lot of line.
Well, so the only reason I disagree is you don't go through. You don't necessarily go through that choke point if you're a character on the other side moving after the choke point's been defeated. So you no longer have to deal with the effects of that if you had stopped there. We never said you have to move each one and deal with effects as we go.
And one could argue that even had an element of linearity to it, right? Because once you got pretty much through one point, you didn't typically go back.
That's true.
So this also reminds me of a game we talked about quite a while ago that neither of you guys have played, is the Star Wars collectible card game. Because in that game, you have players or characters and weapons you can play, but you also have locations that you play out on the board, which is where your characters go. And so, for example, you might play a location from Naboo, and there's a certain way that they arrange on the board, and then you move throughout those locations based on whatever ones are adjacent. And then if you want to go off planet, so say you want to get on a ship and go out to Naboo. You got to go to a docking bay and get on a ship, and then you can go out to Naboo. And then each of the planets themselves have numbers on them so that you line them up in a certain way on the table. So that has a kind of interesting defined movement in that, for the most part, you can only move adjacent, but there are mechanisms that allow you, if you have a really fast ship, you can go from Naboo to Tatooine quicker than, another ship might be able to do. So that kind of reminds me of the Pathfinder card game in that, we kind of laid out the locations. There was a choke point. So, as Brent said, you're going into a castle. Well, the choke point's the gate, right? You got to get through the gate before you can actually go to any of the rooms in the castle. But once you're through the gate, then you could go to any.
Yeah.
So that the Star Wars CCG kind of reminds me of that type of movement as well.
So the other game that I was sitting here thinking about was Space Hulk Death Angel, where you have a bunch of characters sitting in usually a corridor of some sort and fighting monsters throughout that corridor that are coming down. And so your characters are going one way, the monsters are generally going the other way, and you're having to fight those while moving back and forth through that corridor. It's been a while since I played that game, so
that's a pretty accurate description. But you can move, so it's sort of linear in the fact that you can't move side to side, but you can move forward and back. It's one corridor.
Except if I remember right, it also had a feature that moved to the other side of the board, and that's...
So you move to the other side of the board, you flip the facing of your character.
Okay.
So your character was either facing the left side of the corridor or the right side of the corridor, and it took an action to switch that.
So just to wrap up today, we just want to invite you to check out some games that go beyond linear movement, right? That go beyond this Monopoly, Parcheesi type of movement and really get into square, hexagonal, area movement, point-to-point, card movement, any of these that we've talked about today.
Games where adjacency matters.
Games where adjacency matters.
Or teleportation.
Where adjacency doesn't matter.
So we hope you like to move it. We hope you like to move it. Listen to more of our podcasts, invite your friends, play a movement game.
This has been the Analog Gamers Podcast. Thanks for listening. Please spread the word about our podcast, which can be found at theanaloggamers.libsyn.com. You can email us at theanaloggamers@gmail.com or find us on Facebook as The Analog Gamers. Our intro and outro are recorded by Daniel Feldman. Logo artwork provided by Tabitha Jordan Nichols. The Analog Gamers Podcast is licensed under Attribution, No Commercial, Non-Derivative, Creative Commons 4.0 license.